10 years ago, most of the journalists, they tended to report on bigger issues, some very, very great issue. They want to change a lot of things. But for me, I always interested in how the individuals react in this bigger issue, because it's all about people, eventually about how people choose, how people feel. So I always focus on that side.
Aizhe,
Hi.
founder of Gusher FM. Welcome to China Talk.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure.
About a month back, Gusher FM ran an episode that had people telling their stories about their relationships to the podcast. So by way of your introduction, Aizhe, I'm going to tell mine. So I moved to China in 2017 speaking zero Chinese. And many foreigners, myself included, live a pretty sheltered life in China, only encountering super highly educated, often rather westernized Chinese. Your stories broke me out of that bubble when I was in China and inspired me to really listen. And not just to people with perfect Putonghua who watch Western TV in their spare time. You've taken me to places and told me stories I never would have encountered in my daily life. From a homeless shelter in Beijing to a restaurant full of old folks in Shenyang, from a depressed comedian to victims of loan sharks, and even Chinese working in Pakistan. Hundreds and hundreds of windows into the lives of everyday and not so everyday Chinese. Not only that, but your podcast also taught me this language. Gusher FM's Gongzhong Hao has transcripts, and I've spent countless hours with my tutor over the years discussing the content, memorizing words and phrases of,
Oh my God, you're a great
of all these different
learner.
voices that are now in my head. So before we kick this off, Aizhe, I just want to thank you for all that you've done personally for me. It's been a real pleasure to appreciate your work over these past years.
I'm flattered that you love my show so much.
Well, you should be flattered because you do great work. So, Aizhe, if an alien from like Santi, a billion miles away, could listen to Gusher FM and This American Life, what do you think that alien would conclude about the U.S. and China?
Well, human being is so hard to understand. They make very odd decisions. Even they are in the same situation, but they choose very differently. I think it's the same to both U.S. people or Chinese people. So that's why I do this show, because I think the basic feeling, basic experience is universal. No matter where you live, what kind of culture you are in, we tend to make very similar decisions, have similar feelings.
Is there any particular show you recall that imparted that lesson, or is it something you just hear that sort of seeps into you after doing hours and hours of these interviews?
You know, we did a lot of stories about LGBTs, about their dilemma, about how people treat them, how they try to hide them. If you see people in China, in US, in Europe, in Africa, I think they experience the same thing.
So I'm not going to ask you for a specific favorite Gusher FM episode, but I'm curious if there are any in particular that you'd wish Americans or Westerners in general could listen to better understand China.
Well, let me open my list. Because until now, we have did 467 episodes. So quite a lot of stories we aired. But we particularly love some episodes about people in rural area. Because people in rural area, their stories seldom heard by people living in cities, especially for young people. They don't understand older generations' lives in rural area. Especially we aired some stories about old people. They choose to leave their home, to disappear. Some people even committed suicide. So if you know the Chinese society structure better, you will know a lot of issues involved, because for some old people, they worried they are burdened to their families, so they choose this very, how to say, tragic way to avoid give burden to families. So that kind of story really touching. At the beginning, I thought young people may not very interested in this kind of story because it's too far away from them. But quite surprisingly, I found they really love these stories because these stories make them know their country better.
So, how do you think about the mix, I guess? I imagine most of your audience is relatively young and educated.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how you balance the sort of shows of like the recent one with the Dan Liren guy, who most young people have already heard of and watched on a reality show, as opposed to something that would really push their boundaries, like telling stories of the rural elderly.
The Dan Liren story, because that comedian is a friend, so he can be honest to us. So we interview him about how to say, some people curse him quite a lot. He faces a lot of pressure. So he honestly told us about that experience. But for most of the famous people, actually, I don't like to interview them because they're not that honest. Especially for podcasts, for audio media, people can only hear your voice. If you're not honest, people cannot listen. They quit.
So yeah, it just gets boring fast.
Yeah.
You're hiring, which is very exciting. So before we get into what you're hoping to do with your new employees, I'm curious how Gusher FM makes money. You don't seem to have very many ads or sort of sponsored shows. And you make 3 episodes a week, which is incredible.
Yeah, we do a lot of episodes each week. The main way to earn money actually is commercials, but maybe you don't feel them. Strictly speaking, I don't think it's a morally right in Western media, because some episodes our show is commercial. But we can only do this way because in China, every media can only earn money in this way. But the only thing I can guarantee is, even this episode is a commercial, I need to guarantee this episode is a true story and it's interesting enough compared to other episodes. Because speciality is digging out a story. So I think we can help some brand to find where their story is.
I wouldn't be so worried about the morals of it. Western media has to make money too nowadays.
Things changed. Yeah.
So you spent 7 years in journalism on the mainland, Aizhe. I'm curious what changes in the industry have stuck out to you over the years.
I think the 7 years of journalism life helped me a lot because, especially in the early years, I went to every corner of China, cities, rural area, some place I could never been to before. It really made me know this country better, and it made me know a lot of interesting people. So it's easier to create this episode because it's not very hard for me to find the interviewees. Yeah, that's a great benefit for me.
It was sort of a broader question as well, as how the Métis 生态圈 has changed.
Well, it's a sad story because I quit my job in a public library in 2010 to change my career to journalism. I joined 南方周末 Southern Weekly as an intern. I studied journalism there for 6 months. I think 2010, when I quit my last the library job, back then that was the end of a golden age for journalism in China, because back then people can do really amazing stories, can digging out very deep problems. But from then, all the journalists I know, they quit their job, they change their career. Especially today, I found very few people want to be journalists anymore. So that's very sad.
And you think that's a function of the market forces or people being frustrated about the types of things they can report on and stories they can tell?
I think both. Capital or some higher pressure, a lot of pressures combined make journalism in China harder. So people get really frustrated. So for Good Chef, I think the basic thing we can do, the least thing we can do is focus on individuals, only tell the individuals, people's story.
Yeah, because you do occasionally have shows that touch on social issues and social challenges. So I guess your idea is by doing it just at the very personal level of the way folks have experienced these sorts of issues in society, that is the best strategy for you to keep reporting about these sorts of topics.
Exactly. And also, 10 years ago, most of the journalists, they tended to report on bigger issues, some very, very great issue. They want to change a lot of things. But for me, I always interested in how the individuals react in this bigger issue, because it's all about people, eventually about how people choose, how people feel. So I always focus on that side.
Aside from opening people's minds, have there been any stories where the reaction to it had a broader impact, you think, or resonated wider than your average episode?
Any episodes of Good FM changed something?
Yeah, like the lives of the interviewees or the institution that you wrote about or something like that.
Yeah, actually, there's a lot of changes to individuals. We aired a story about a young guy who said he was in masturbation addiction. He was so painful, Actually, it's because of his childhood experience that influenced him so much. So he often get nervous. He cannot make friends. He worried a lot. After that episode aired, he got thousands of replies. People want to add him on social media to be his friend. So not long after that episode aired, he told us he know a girl now. So that changed him a lot.
Aizhe, it seems like there's an aspect of telling everyday people's stories which is kind of in itself a little bit aggressive, controversial. I remember watching 神秘的角落, the iQIYI show, and just being kind of surprised at watching a 电视剧 about not a rich family in Beijing who's like driving fancy cars. I'm curious why you think these stories aren't as common or told as much or don't get as much attention in the kind of broader media environment in China.
I think people get sick of rich people's life, celebrities' people's life. If you see the Chinese movie market, you can see people more and more like realistic issues, movies. It's like 神秘的角落 or some 我不是药神, this kind of stories. So
yeah,
I think this kind of topic getting much more popular now and in the future. So I think Good FM focus on realistic stories. It's a great way to bring people together, bring people closer, to peek into ordinary's different life. It's also satisfying.
How many movie producers have come to you after hearing a Gusher FM and said, "Oh, I need to make a movie about this story"? Has that happened yet?
Yeah, of course, that happened a few times. I think 4 or 5 times. But in China, copyright is a big problem. Normally, people don't tell you. They just change that story in another way and make something out of it. You don't know it.
As long as it makes for better movies, we can't complain too much. Well, yeah. I guess you can complain, but I'll be happy. I'm curious, Aizhe, pushing the model forward. You guys have done many of these shows, which all have a relatively similar structure. I'm curious if you've come across any stories that deserve a serial treatment, like the Serial podcast, yeah. A story big enough that should be a 10-part episode or something that you have a producer spending a whole year on.
Well, you asked a right question. We are preparing. We have listed some stories. Try to make some really big stories in 2021. But I don't think it lasts like 10 part. It's too long. Maybe 5, 6 episodes. We started serial a lot. But I think it's really hard to copy in China because especially for crime stories, I envy you American people. You can access a lot of document from the police department, from the court, but it's impossible for us in China, you know. So we are still looking for what kind of stories we can do in China.
I guess generally with the longer ones that have been very successful in the West, like Shithole or Serial, very quickly you go beyond the individual, right?
Yeah.
And you start talking about the system and the society, and that may take you to places which are uncomfortable to do in the domestic context, I imagine.
Yeah, for one thing, you can have access so many documents. On the other thing, you don't need to avoid any topic, but it's both problem for us. We need to carefully avoid a lot of things. But especially for podcast, I always tell my team, if there's elephant in room, you cannot pretend it not exist. Because if there's a logic in the story you didn't explain, people would ask. They wondering.
Yeah.
So if they have question, they cannot focus on the rest part of the story. So that's really hard.
Yeah. Or you just stop going into rooms with elephants in them, and that's depressing also.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm curious, Aizhe, aside from the serial model, what other types of formats are you thinking about in terms of shows? I spend a lot of time on Xiao Yuzhou, and 99% of Chinese podcasts right now are basically 2 people talking or 3 people talking or 5 people talking, very much like my show, China Talk, which I do because it's easy and inexpensive, but there's a lot more out there with more production and more effort that's possible with audio. So I'm curious what other ideas you're thinking about or you'd like someone else to do to push the medium forward on the mainland.
I think for next step, I definitely will make a show like Plenty Money because I love it so much. I cannot like other people to do this kind of a show first. I need to hurry. And also, there's a lot of audio documentary type. There's one documentary from BBC. I really love it because they go around the world, go to a lot of countries, places to record the things happening. Actually, we did some episodes like that, but that is really expensive. Not only about money, also about time. We can only produce one episode, maybe in 1 month. It's very costly.
I'm curious, Aizhe, how are you at managing people? What's been the process for you of growing this team and teaching people this art form, which is very new to China?
The key, I think, is to give enough freedom to your team to make your team be creative. I know for some media, the chief editor is so demanding. They want to control a lot of things, especially on what story you should report or story you cannot. But I wouldn't say that to my team. I want my producers have their interest. They can do whatever story they like. But in the process of our work, there's one part is called trial listening. Every story need to be listened. Our team, we will give a score, we will give a critique. If most of us say this is a very good story, we can listen to the last minute. I will air this story. If people don't give a very good critique, I will not let it out. So I only control the last part. I don't want to control the previous part.
What values do you think you and your team share? And what about those 价值观 do you think makes you potentially overlook things in the stories you find and tell?
I think being inclusive is the most important thing. You can see from our show, I seldom judge or give any opinion on any story, any interviewee, because I would ask me the same question every time. If I was him or her, can I make a better choice? So I don't think I'm in the right position to judge them. I only need to show what kind of a problem they are facing and to make people be them in the right circumstances to feel what they felt. That's enough. What people judge, I can't control how our listeners judge them, but I can guarantee myself will not judge on them.
Do you think that's a rare attitude nowadays in China?
I know, because in China, especially love to new media, the hosts, they want to show what they think, their opinion. But it's not my style. I think even in daily life, my normal life, I'm not a person who speak a lot. I always want to listen what other people say.
You've said in an interview, Aizhe, that your dream for 故事 FM is that 30 years from now, it serves as a bit of a time capsule for this era. How do you think, more generally, China nowadays treats personal memory and personal histories?
People's value changed very rapidly. I think 5 years before, people's value is quite different with nowadays. So it's much shorter than I expected, because I don't need to wait 30 years. Maybe 10 years later, when you look back to listen our episode 10 years before, you will be surprised. So that's quite interesting. I think that way you can call us oral history. We keep people's thought, people's accent, people's opinion in the capsule, so you can taste them later, 10 years later, like a good wine.
I remember Su Hua of Kuaishou used to talk about how, and I think Zhang Yiming also talked about how Duan Shiping is also like a historical museum that people will go back to figure out what times were like in the past. But I'd much prefer 故事 FM. I think you guys are like the expensive wine, and they're like the 10 kuai baijiu from the corner store.
I'm so flattered. Thank you. Well, but I do think if you want to know the details, what people experienced, it at least take a long time, at least 30 minutes show, right? If people can only see 10 or 20 seconds of short video, it doesn't explain too much.
What other independent media do you think also exemplifies the values that 故事 FM has?
It's not really many similar media like 故事 FM, but if you say nonfiction media, there's some in China. There's one called 真实故事计划, also one called 网易人间. They both do nonfiction.
Have you spent any time on Clubhouse these past few days? Did you miss that moment? Or
It's so funny. Last night was my first, a friend created a room for me to meet our fans. But right before that event, 2 hours before, Clubhouse was banned. So funny. But we continued anyway. I was so surprised that more than 1,000 people came in.
Oh my God. What was that like?
Well, I didn't feel much because I can't see their face.
Did you listen to any of the other rooms? Or was that your only time on Clubhouse?
Not much, because I'm really busy recent days, so I didn't spend much time on that. But I think it's a great opportunity for a podcast because people start to realize how audio charming when people use their voice to convey some message. There's less misunderstanding.
I really felt like in some of these rooms, listening to people all around the world talk about sensitive issues, it really felt like I was listening to a Gusher FM live. if it was 1986 and Gusher FM could do whatever it wanted or something. It was sort of the attitude that people took to these rooms of just telling their perspectives and telling their stories. It really reminded me of your show.
Yeah, it is a very rare opportunity. There was one room, a lot of young people from mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, they can share their opinion peacefully. That's really rare, very valuable.
Yeah. Yeah, it was something, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Is there anyone you'd want Biden to listen to from your library?
I give a lot of hope to Biden because maybe he's more inclusive, not like Trump. So I'm not worried that much. I expect the China-US relationship getting better. I don't know, maybe it's still hard for any politician in US to understand the daily Chinese life. What do you think as an American, if American people can understand Story FM?
I'll tell you one thing is I am almost certain that there are people working in the White House now who listen to Gusher FM.
Really?
Yeah, definitely.
Oh my God.
More than just any show in particular, the moral of Gusher FM, if there is one, which is that China is more than the Chinese government or the party. There's more than 1 billion people who all have their lives and are all trying to make their way in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an important lesson that sometimes gets lost if you can only engage with China through English language media and reporting and sources. Some Western reporters certainly are committed to doing this kind of storytelling as well, but it's hard through a language barrier, right? And it's hard if you've never spent time in a country and in a small way at least got to know a few of its people to make sure that the way you think about the country isn't just through its government and its leadership and its policies. And I think that more than any particular episode is what I want Biden to do when he's studying Mandarin in his spare time.
We try to translate some of our episode into English. Maybe in the future we can cooperate with some English radio stations to air our stories in English. Maybe that's good model for us.
Well, if you pick someone besides me, I'm going to be very angry with you. but I'll understand. You've been introduced to these producers, right? At Podfest, there were some Western producers, right?
Right.
You know people at This American Life and Planet Money at this point?
Yeah, actually, I cooperated with This American Life before in 2017 when I just created Gusher FM. When not many people know us, This American Life, they try to find a fixer in China because they wanted to do a story about traffic jam. Because in 2008, there was heavy snow. The weather was very cold. A lot of people jammed on highway. So I found a truck driver for them. They interviewed him. That's the only time I cooperated with This American Life. Then a few years later, New York Times reported us. That producer from This American Life wrote me an email. She said, "Oh, I didn't know you are the Chinese version of Era Glass." It's funny. After this COVID, I'd love to go to US to meet a lot of people. I really wanted to know Eric Glass in person. Also want to go to NPR to really visit the Planet Money office. I'd love to see them. I love a lot of American shows, podcasts, also some English ones, like Planet Money, like This American Life, like Snap Judgment, all these narrative podcasts. I really love listening them. If any producer in these shows want to cooperate with Gush FM, please find Jordan. He can get in touch with me. I'd love to cooperate with you guys.
I have a funny story for you, actually. I was applying to be an intern at Planet Money, and it was actually after I graduated college. So
what was that?
I wasn't technically allowed to be this was in when I graduated college. I'm 30 years old, so I graduated in 2012. Yeah, long time ago. So anyways, they wanted me to pitch a story. And the story I pitched was actually about China. I pitched it about YY. And because this was like very early days of live streaming and no one had heard of live streaming before. And I was like, this is a really cool story. And in the interview, they tell me, where did you get this idea from? And I was like, I don't know. I have my friend. He researches Chinese companies. He told me about this. And they're like, well, Jordan, I've done hundreds of these interviews of interns. And this is the first time I've ever heard a pitch of a show that we're going to do on air next week. So they really liked me, but it was really sad because I was too old and they didn't let me join it.
Too old?
I know. It's because it was like an intern for college students and I wasn't a college student anymore. So they were very nice to me, but they said, sorry, you can't be an intern. So had that happened, maybe this would have been my real profession many years before it became.
You should be their producer.
I should have been. They missed their chance, Aizhe.
Yeah, I guarantee
that. Have you heard Fresh Air by Terry Gross? Have you heard any of those shows?
Yeah, actually, I know that show, but I seldom hear that because I'm not a fan of a talk show. I'm a fan of a narrative podcast.
Yeah.
But I do know Terry is a very good interviewer. It's kind of like hard talk. Sometimes she asks very direct question. It's really interesting. But in my show, normally I will cut off my questions. I want people really immerse into the interviewee's part of the story.
Yeah, I was thinking that's another sort of style which doesn't exist in China. I've come across at least, of an interviewer who will push back and challenge.
Yeah, we do try that. But it's not hard in China, especially for some news happening. All people are paying attention to that. You need a journalist certificate to do things like that. So let's say we need to avoid being paid attention too much.